9 months before 9/11, I showed up to 1st Ranger Battalion. You're pre 9/11. When I was at 1st Battalion, there was a lot of mid-career, 10, 12 years. They were like, I'm getting out. This war thing's never happening. It's never going to happen. I'm going to go do something else. Which sounds kind of weird that people, leave the Army because they not go into war, but that's just kind of a mentality that I think our whole community has, right? We do all this stuff. We put our body through a lot of things, and to never get to play the game is it's a thing for us. It's a thing that most people will never understand. Did you see the same thing in the SF community pre 9/11?
Yeah. In fact, I can speak for myself, saying there were times when I was like, all right, well, especially when I was doing my team time as a captain, as an ODA commander, I was like, well, maybe I need to look at FBI or, the agency. I was looking at a lot of different U.S. Marshals. I was investigating all that stuff. And at that time, I was a senior captain, soon to get promoted to major at the schoolhouse, right? And I was kind of looking at all that stuff, and really I was saying that same time frame you talked about, around 12 years or so. I was like, man, I want to get out and do stuff for real, And so I started looking at that, and then. Sometimes things just happen, right? I don't know if you know General Boykin.
Yeah, I know.
All right, so he was the commander at the Special Warfare Center at the time, and I was like his what they call it, a Secretary General Staff.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So I wasn't his aide. Wasn't that cool, right?
Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett, and today my guest is Pat Marques. Pat is a former SF officer, and we're not going to hold that against him. We Rangers and SF have crossed many paths, especially in the last 20 years, and it'll be very interesting. I know the listeners will too, to be hear the SF side of kind of the last 20 years and post 9/11 and all that stuff. But I'm not going to steal all the time here to begin. I'm going to pass it off to Pat, let him introduce himself, and we'll get on with the conversation.
Hey, thanks very much, man. Appreciate having me on. I guess, a little bit of my background. Like I said, I was in SF, and I started off in the infantry, though. I basically went through Army ROTC at Indiana University. Seems like thousands of years ago, back in the 80s. And graduated and got commissioned in 1990, and went infantry right off the bat. Went to Korea and did a extended tour there, about 18 months. Then ended up at 1st of the 509th, the OPFOR battalion there at JRTC. And when I was there, that's when I went through selection and made it through selection for SF. And then after that, into a little bit of schooling and the Q course and things like that. And then I spent all my operational time was at 10th Special Forces Group at Fort Carson. But did a tour at the schoolhouse there at Fort Bragg and out at Camp McCall.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm sure we'll talk about later because that's where I was when 9/11 happened. But and then basically 2 tours in Iraq with 10th Special Forces Group, and then some other little tours in some other places like Special Operations Command, and then back at Northcom, which is here in Colorado Springs.
Yeah, that's awesome. If in the military wise, I spent all of my time in Savannah, Georgia, and Columbus, Georgia. But if I could have picked anywhere, I think to go, it would have been to Fort Carson there. And I always thought, I've been there a few times for training. I loved that post. I just love that area. A lot of stuff to do. So I'm kind of jealous you got to spend a lot of time there. And, before we kind of get into your military story and your background, to set the stage a little bit for what this podcast is all about, what's your definition of vulnerability?
Yeah, always starting off with the easy questions. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries.
I've kind of thought about it a little bit, and I think, for me, it's really about knowing what you don't know and knowing what you know and being okay with that, right? Being okay with not knowing everything, right? Guys in just our line of work in general, right?
Yeah.
Hyper masculine environment, hyper competitive, and you're kind of expected to know everything and be good at everything all the time. And so for me, one of the things that I've found, and I think I stumbled upon it, it's not like I had some great insight in the military, was really just being able to say, you know what, I don't know everything. And especially as an officer, for me, you had to admit that in a sense, right? You had to be comfortable with that and be able to, especially when you get into like an SF with now you're all with these super experienced NCOs, right? Which was the coolest thing about being an SF. I mean, I loved working with soldiers, young soldiers as well, but it was really cool to be around all these really experienced NCOs and just be able to say, hey man, I'm going to listen to everybody. I'm going to take in everybody's input, because if you think you know it all, I can guarantee you don't. And so if you pretend you do, you're just going to get yourself in trouble, and the guys and maybe gals around in trouble, So
Yeah.
that's really what it was for me, was like being honest about the things I'm not as good at or that I don't know about, and then finding those around me who were.
Yeah. And I think that's super important. I think any military background, any background at all, if you try to fake it and do something that, try to do something that you don't know, one, you might fail, but in the military, you might get somebody killed. Right. So,
Right.
being upfront with that. And then I've always found if you're honest about what you don't know, people will rally around you and get you up to speed and make you and the team more successful in the long run. So I couldn't agree more. And to go to your military service here, so you joined into the infantry, and I talked to a lot of guys that officers, and we went the infantry route. There's something that drew us to the infantry, and there's a kind of this misconception about the infantry that they're a bunch of knuckle draggers. But honestly, I had a guy on last week on the podcast who was a Harvard graduate, and he was an infantry officer. So some of the most brilliant minds I ever met was in the infantry. What led you to the military, and why'd you choose to detail infantry?
So, I didn't have a bunch of military family experience, right? I mean, my dad had gotten drafted like everybody in the late 50s, early 60s, did a stint in the army, in Germany. He was not a big fan of it. He did not want me.
Right.
He was like, what do you want to do that for? I mean, it's just, it wasn't him. And, I didn't have like an uncle who was in Vietnam or anything like that. But for whatever reason, I just grew up like always, idolizing the military and just thought it was cool. I think there was something about the physicality of it that appealed to me. I wrestled in high school and college, and I wanted to, I wanted to use my body as much as my mind, I guess, and whatever I was going to do. And, it's funny, when we talk about the infantry and people not really understanding why you go into it. In my commissioning class in ROTC at Indiana University in 1990, I think there were 45 of us getting commissioned as second lieutenants. I was the only guy going infantry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was the only person going infantry. And I can remember people going, why are you doing that? And I was like, isn't it like the core of the Army?
Right.
Isn't it what everything else supports? Like, that's what I want to do.
Right.
I want to do, the job that everyone else is supporting to make happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I just thought it was the most physical and the most, I guess the hardest really, and, I was not a super tough dude or anything, but I wanted to be challenged.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do something that had some rigor to it, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And you weren't going to get that more than in the infantry.
Right.
So,
yeah, and I think, that's the reason I joined the infantry side and went to the Ranger Regiment, was for those exact same reasons. And I just, I was surprised. I wonder what your perspective is. I was surprised when I got in, got through all the training and got to First Ranger Battalion down there. I was surprised at how intellectual the infantry really was. How much you have to know every job as an infantryman. Did that surprise you a little bit once you got past, the physicality, that's a challenge, but were you surprised at all? Like, hey, I got to be a lot more smart here than I maybe thought I would have had to have been.
Yeah, it was interesting, and I was in Korea I probably got there in 91, right? In fact, as a platoon leader in Korea, I was fortunate enough to run the last combat patrols on the DMZ
Oh,
before we
wow.
handed over to the ROK Army. And so I was like, we got there, it was, because if you were back in the 90s, right, you got live ammo when you went to the range.
Right.
Right. So, we're patrolling live ammo and stuff. And so right in the beginning, it was very serious in a sense, it wasn't just training. And the guys, it was the same way. I had, I had fellow platoon leaders that were ROTC and then a bunch who were West Pointers. These guys were mechanical engineering graduates and stuff. And a lot of the soldiers we had too were really sharp, and knew everything about the job and were able to. I guess the biggest thing that jumped out at me was the ability to adapt to any situation.
Yes.
And come up with ideas that worked no matter what was happening. And so, yeah, it was not that I minded knuckle dragging. I could do it with the best of them, but,
Right.
but, and, we had our fair share of that too, but yeah, guys were very sharp and, very intelligent and wanted to do the job well, right? You couldn't just be in the infantry and like skate by.
Yep.
You had to know a lot of stuff and be able to adapt on the fly. So yeah, it was surprising to me. I would say, pleasantly surprising that a lot of from the lowest ranking guy, to the highest ranking officer and all the NCOs in between, the amount of intelligence and skill they brought to the job.
Yeah. So you did the infantry thing for a while in the conventional army, and eventually went the SF route. When Ranger PLs come in, to the Ranger Regiment, it's because they want another challenge, and they, if they stay on the conventional side, they do their one time as a PL, and that's kind of it. So if you come into the regiment, you can stay in more operational a little bit longer. The job is, again, you get to stay with the boys longer is the crux of it. And then when I see junior Ranger officers leave and go the SF route, it's for the same reason, because they don't want to go to that field grade level and basically ride a desk for the next 15 years. Was that your purpose for joining the SF community, and what kind of led you to it?
In a nutshell, yes. In fact, my first goal was to try to get to Ranger Regiment as a PL, right? Back in the early 90s, I can't say this statistic is for sure, but this is what I was told then, right? That the Ranger Regiment pulled 95% of their lieutenants from Korea because of the DMZ mission, right? Now, it ended within the first 6 months of me being there, unfortunately.
Right.
And so I talked to, and what happened is the S1s from the 3 battalions would come over and go to all the infantry units and interview anybody who was interested in going to regiment. And so I interviewed with the 2nd Battalion, S1 actually at the time. But I had just gotten there. I was less than 6 months on the ground. He's like, you need some more PL time, right? And then I'll be back next year, and then let's talk again. I like everything I'm seeing, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, awesome. Within that next year, the DMZ mission stops. The S1s never came back over.
Oh, wow.
So, would I have gone to SF if I had ended up in the Ranger Regiment? I don't know, actually, because I might have just said, hey, I love it. I'm staying. But I was for sure going when that didn't happen.
Right.
And quite honestly, at JRTC, and back in it was all pre 9/11 days, that training as basically the op four, being a guerrilla in a sense,
Yeah.
was probably the best training you could do for getting prepared to be in special forces. So, but so yeah, I wanted to stay operational, and I was fortunate, man. I had out of my 18 months in Korea, 15 months of that was platoon leader time. I had another 15 months in the op four. So I had 30 plus months of platoon leader time, which was a lot.
Yeah, that's rare.
Yeah. Yeah, very rare. And so, I was really, that was what you said, though, staying, with the boys and staying operational was my entire intent. So you get 2 years on an SF team. I was a headquarters company commander for another year. I had 2 commands as a major, and that was just my goal to stay in that realm as long as I could. So, but that was really why, because I wanted to, one, the challenge. 2, I thought it was a cool mission in that you were, you got these, 12 guys if you have a full ODA, which of course no one ever had pre 9/11, but and you're out on your own, really.
Yeah.
And operationally, and so that was very attractive to me, and just being able to do a variety of missions, which was called for at SF, was something I thought was attractive. But staying operational was the big thing for sure for me. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what was your selection experience like? If there's anybody out there, obviously it's probably evolved since back then, but there's still a lot of things that are the same. What mentality would you tell somebody that's thinking right now, hey, I'm going to go to SF selection as a junior officer, or even an enlisted person? Uh, what do you think it takes to get through SF selection?
Well, SF selection it's changed a little bit over the years and stuff like that, at different times and things. I think it's back to very similar to when I went through. There are individual events, when you've got to be able to hump a ruck for a very long distance, land navigating on your own, with nobody else, for long distances. And then there are like team events, right? And so obviously you got to be in shape.
Right.
You've got to be able to hump a rock for ever. And the second thing, though, is that one of the big things that was selected for was your ability to be a team player, right? And so all the time in the Army, you would get in schoolhouse environments, you're getting peer reviews, right, and ratings around you and stuff like that. And that was a big matter of fact. They took out the team events at one point in the history of the selection course, and then they put them back in because what they realized was that was a needed part of evaluating how someone does under pressure, among others. And when you're in charge, can you stay calm and make things happen even when they set the situation up that you're going to fail for sure? And then when you're not in charge, are you heave-hoing like everybody else and trying to, help the team? And so that was a big part of it is knowing your place in that selection course and always trying to, not what we call it in Ranger School, Sunshine Ranger, right?
Yeah.
Not just shine when it was your time. So it was there was that same aspect of Ranger School, right? Of that being able to always be pulling your weight or more than your weight if you needed to, because the deal that you can't fake that.
Right. Yep.
Yep.
You
can't fake it. So
yeah, that always seems when you're in those, Ranger School or RAS, the Ranger Selection Program, or SF, even though I didn't go through, and the cream eventually rises, right? And you see who's working together and who's willing to take care of one another. So I'd be curious. So I came in pre 9/11 barely, right? I was 9 months before 9/11, I showed up to 1st Ranger Battalion. You're pre 9/11. When I was at 1st Battalion, there was a lot of mid-career, 10, 12 years, they were like, I'm getting out. This war thing's never happening. It's never going to happen. I'm going to go do something else. Which sounds kind of weird that people, leave the Army because they not going to war, but that's just kind of a mentality that I think our whole community has, right? We do all this stuff. We put our body through a lot of things, and to never get to play the game it's a thing for us. It's a thing that most people will never understand. Did you see the same thing in the SF community pre 9/11?
Yeah. In fact, I can speak for myself saying there were times when I was like, all right, well, I've done, especially when I was doing my team time as a captain, as a ODA commander, I was like, well, maybe I need to look at FBI or, the agency, or I mean, I was looking at a lot of different U.S. Marshals. I was investigating all of that stuff. And at that time, I was kind of a senior captain, soon to get promoted to major at the schoolhouse, right? And I was kind of looking at all that stuff, and really kind of, I was saying that same time frame you talked about, around 12 years or so. I was like, man, I want to get out and do stuff for real, And so I started looking at that, and then. Sometimes things just happen, right? I don't know if you know General Boykin.
Yeah, I know.
All right, so he was the commander at the Special Warfare Center at the time, and I was like his what do they call it, a Secretary General Staff.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So I wasn't his aide. That wasn't that cool, right? I was, but I did a bunch of other stuff for him, right? And so the guy who was running F Company, which was the field training phase for the Q course. So that all the land nav, small unit tactics, and the Robin Sage course, the unconventional warfare training. That guy got fired. And so General Boykin pulls me in his office. He's like, all right, Pat, I want to send you down there and take over that company. So he was jumping over the group commander, the battalion commander, to pick who was going to go down there. And so you don't say no to General Boykin, right? So not that I would have anyway, but I said, okay, let's do it, sir. And so I went into a rough situation in that my two immediate supervisors, I was not the pick. That would have been their pick, and there were a lot of reasons for that. The deal, right? So, but anyway, so I ended up there. I'm like, all right, well, this is it. So boom, I'm like a new major and I'm in command. I got a command already, right? So that's when 9/11 happened, a few months after I took command. So no one gave a crap about of the Robin Sage exercise until the guys were on horseback in, October, and all that good stuff, right? Suddenly it was, but one of the coolest things was that, by the spring of that year, I had that team leader and NCO's office team talking to my students, telling them about, yes, what you're doing in this exercise is exactly what you'll be doing, right? So kind of come back to what you were saying. That's what, I was thinking the same thing, personally thinking the same thing. I knew a lot of other guys were. And then 9/11 just changed everything for, next 20 years.
Yeah.
And then everybody was, of course, I was in the schoolhouse and all of us were trying to get out of the schoolhouse. That wasn't happening, right? But everybody's like, sir, I got to get back to my group. I'm like, yeah, I know you do, dude. So do I. But guess what? Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, God, man, that changed the military.
It did. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and to kind of caveat off that, so I saw that 20 years I was in the regiment. During all that time, I saw it evolve and change, and a lot of things happen. From that first deployment to the last deployment when they were the last ones out of Bagram there.
Right.
And I'm sure that, and I witnessed all the other tier organizations go through a lot of changes too. From SF, the horse soldiers, they were doing their SF mission to it became a more conventional fight, and SF was kind of took a backseat for a while and tried to figure out where to fit in. And the regiment went through all of those same ebbs and flows. What are just some of the evolutions you saw in SF during the global war on terrorism?
And so it was kind of interesting, right? So the true mission of special forces, its first mission is unconventional warfare, right? So fighting with, by, and through, your native forces, if you will, right? That just like those guys were doing with the Northern Alliance and things like that. Because SF, the history of it comes from the Jedburgh teams in World War II, jumping into partisan France, linking up with partisans, doing training, equipping, and leading to some degree, and fighting the Nazis at that time, right, from behind enemy lines. And that's the true mission of special forces. All the other things, foreign internal defense, where you're trained, which I did a lot of as a captain, right, go into places like the Czech Republic and Turkey and Bosnia, and training is all a, kind of a, hey, in peacetime, keep up with how you interact and work with foreign forces. That's the real purpose of that fifth mission, right? But then it would, as things change, so obviously a lot of true unconventional warfare in the beginning in Afghanistan, right? In the beginning of Iraq, when we went in, and it was a lot of intelligence gathering, actually, and running, small direct action operations in support of the ground commanders around us, right? And the brigades around us. And because when I went in, and I was driving around Iraq in a Land Rover with no doors.
Right. Yep.
Right. Well, it was my whole first tour there, right? And so so we had, except for like 5th Special Forces Group, that was had a more desert orientation, who had the Humvees rigged up for that. Nobody even had up armor. Nobody had anything like that, right? So you were making do with what you had. And then as Iraq, by the time I into my second tour of Iraq, now I'm like a battalion XO, not doing cool guy stuff anymore. But then it was all about training like the commando unit and the counterterrorism force. And so it became, and now they were still operating with them. They were joint operation, basically with those Iraqi forces. But then it became more of that kind of a mission for a long time. And it kind of ebbed and flowed back between that. And all my time was in Iraq, so I was never in Afghanistan. But of course, the guys were doing that there as well. Yeah. So there was a lot more of that kind of missions, and then a lot of intel gathering type, missions that were going on. But the doing intelligence operations and working with the whichever Afghans or with the Iraqis became a lot bigger over time, and then that flowed into kind of of course I was out by this time, but places like Syria, and things like that, guys are probably still doing that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the GWAT was as far as long as it went, and everybody that we lost and everything. As a military, we learned a lot, in the GWAT, and especially I think the soft side of the military. We just learned a lot. We learned how to evolve quickly and grow whole organizations within organizations to meet a need and meet a demand, because there wasn't anything out there for it. I kind of sat back in awe sometimes when I'd watch either the regiment or other tier units or SF just evolve to what the fight needed. It was pretty amazing. It was pretty amazing to watch. And, I'm grateful to have been part of it. And we could talk about, that could be a whole podcast, I think, in itself, talking about all that stuff that we saw and we did over those years. But all the time you spent in the military, what was your most challenging day in uniform?
Well, that was, so I was fairly fortunate in that I only lost one guy in Iraq, and he was a team sergeant on one of my teams. So I had 4 teams. This is early on. This is in Iraq, like summer to fall 03. So the Sunni Triangle, if anybody remembers that. That's where my company was. I had 4 teams. They were living out on the economy. So they were in hardened houses, complexes. We brought down Peshmerga platoons from the Kurd region. Iraqis are not happy with that, but as security forces, and so we were out. So my company, my sergeant major, right, and I were out on the roads almost every day, driving to resupply all the teams and stuff, and then very early 04, January of 04, we had gotten some Humvees, but not up armored. So we were still driving around in doorless Land Rovers, right?
Right.
And my one team sergeant they got hit with an IED, and so he was medevaced to Baghdad. We drove all the way down to Baghdad, and he was dead, unfortunately.
Oh,
right.
yeah.
So I'm sitting there in the hospital, me and my sergeant major, right, and who was he was longtime SF guy, but had started Second Ranger Battalion, and the team leader, and we're talking to a neurosurgeon, and the guy's like, hey, man, basically he's gone, right? Still breathing, right? Because the dude was like John Wayne. That was the hardest thing. It was like John Wayne going down in one of his own movies.
Oh,
right? He had spent some time attached to some other tiered units, right? So he was very operationally savvy. He was a killer, and I mean he was bigger than life kind of a guy, right? I'll be honest, he was a pain in my ass in garrison, but he was like, I used to joke about, he was like break glass in time of war.
Yeah, we all know that guy.
Right, that was him, and so I'm like, oh man, so we called his father from Baghdad, to let him know the situation, and I was like, sir, what do you want me to do, right? Because I will do whatever you want me to do. Which was weird to think that, right? Halfway across the world, you could call back and, you know what I mean? But, and he just says, you tell me when it's over.
Yeah.
And so he would never really say, which I understood. And in retrospect, I was like, it was a terrible question to ask the poor father, but so, I had to tell the neurosurgeon, hey man, all right, let's pull the plug then. And that was just, and then of course he's such a bear of a man that he freaking doesn't go for a while,
right,
because his body's trying to live, and but yeah, that was it's always, I mean, God, I lost guys in training accident, what I mean, or been around it and stuff, and that always sucks, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, having to make that decision, and then call his dad back, and that the guy was he was a hero to his team too, right? So that took a lot of extra support for me and my sergeant major for that team, because we had 2 or 3 more months to go, right?
Yeah.
And operations weren't slowing down.
Yeah.
That's it. So that's always the hardest part, is everybody's got to stay on, right?
Yeah.
And you can't go off, and then so that was clearly my worst day.
Yeah.
In the military, the hardest day for sure, and very close to that was the warrant officer on that team, after we got back, committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just a brutal time for that team, and for all the guys, on that team, and and then you got to square that up somehow, right? You got to try to make sense of the things that you can't make sense of, and so you memorialize as best you can, and you get people back to work, right? But not without recognizing what happened, and I think back now, and you probably experienced this too, all the different things that you experienced and saw is that, I probably could have handled that in some better ways. I probably could have done a few things that would have been better for myself, but less so me, for the guys on his team, but regret's kind of a useless emotion.
Right.
It doesn't really get you anything, so
right.
You just you move on, right?
Yeah, I've been on both sides, at the operational level, when you're in the squad or the platoon and you lose somebody. It's I thought it was more difficult when I was at a staff level, and I'm telling these guys they have to push through. You got to get back on the helicopters. The mission's continuing.
Right.
I always kind of felt like an asshole,
Right.
like an unempathetic asshole, and it was hard when I had to go visit somebody in the the hospital there on Bath on Bagram. That was one of my boys that was wounded. I
Yeah.
watched it all go down on a screen inside my comfort of the operations center, and it was just those were hard times. Those were just hard because you don't know what to say, right? Because either way,
Yeah.
you weren't there. People second guess things. It's just that's a really tough position to be in. I always thought when I as I matured in the military, I hated those times. But with the bad times, was just as many good times. What was your? Is there still a time you look back on with like a memory or a time with the boys or something that you would say was your best day in uniform?
Yeah. I mean, that's almost, that's harder to even figure out right there,
Yeah,
really, I mean, because there were so many awesome times. I mean, there's all the cool things you do, skiing out of the back of a Chinook at 14,000 feet at midnight in Colorado was pretty cool, right? Doing some cool guy stuff like that. But at the same time, the best time was that time in Iraq. Unfortunately, when I lost my team sergeant there, but that's and the deal. That's a camaraderie that just does. I mean, cannot be replaced by anything else in the world. And I've played a lot of sports at a lot of high levels and stuff, and nothing compares to that experience, and especially, coming off of like a really difficult mission where nobody got hurt and the mission was totally successful, and so that, and you remember, obviously the op tempos were just insane,
yeah,
right? I mean, just, I had to start telling my guys, all right, you're taking Sundays off for a while, a couple
right.
of weeks, right? We got to, you know, so we don't get sloppy and overconfident and stuff. But but just being around that, well, like you talked about, doing the deal for real as opposed to training, right? And being around all that competence, uh, and just seeing the success over and over again, was that first tour in Iraq for me was by far the best. Nothing came close to it in 20 years,
Right.
just because of that. Being around all those competent individuals, doing great missions, and being successful. Yeah, that was just,
Yeah.
gets tough to replace, which becomes a problem
Yeah.
all on its own.
Yeah, I'm sure you get the question all the time when you run into people the how's retirement? How's the and I say, retirement's good. I don't miss the operational side as much as I thought I would, but I miss the boys. I just miss being
Yeah,
around those people because I still feel that way. That's the one place I can truly be myself, right? And let my
yeah,
guard down 100%. And I know whatever I say isn't going to be judged and looked at. It's probably going to be mocked and made fun of, or it's going to be a joke about
yeah.
it. But just that team environment is something that it can't explain unless you've been in it, and it's definitely what I miss the most. And so you eventually transitioned. What led you to transition out of service? Why'd you make that decision to hang up the uniform when you did?
So I I was I kind of thought all my cool guy stuff was over from the army after my second tour, 10th group, and and going to Iraq, stuff like that. And I was down at SOCOM doing a desk job that everyone's got to do at some point, right? And I ended up coming out on the battalion command list for 3rd Battalion, 10th Group, which was my battalion, right? So it was like a dream scenario, for an officer, right? To get battalion command, because from second lieutenant on, I can't remember what that percentage is, but man,
Yeah.
it dwindles down, right? Um, and but my marriage was not going well, right? And so I was getting divorced. I actually got pre-positioned back here to Colorado Springs, and was at Peterson Air Force Base there's a special operations division for Northcom. Basically, I was working out of, but I was getting divorced, and I was like, I just, there's no way and I got 3 little girls at the time. Right? I just couldn't see how I could be a good battalion commander and a good father in that situation. It was just like, man, I just can't see how I'm going to do that, you know? And so I'm hurting both sides there, right? The guys who I'm supposed to be in command of, my kids, you know? And so, yeah, I just made that call. I was like, it's time to punch out, and I've got to focus on being a dad, and you know, and go into a different line of work, and do something else, you know. And man, did I hear about it from some guys that were in that battalion. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes you feel good, but you know, kind of makes you feel like crap too.
Yeah.
So it was in a way it was a tough decision, and in a way it kind of wasn't, you know, because you think about your kids, and you know, and it's just tough when you're gone all the time.
Yeah.
You know, to be really part of their life and stuff, and sometimes it works out well, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of factors go into that. But I just knew that I wasn't going to be able, because that was meaning gone a lot more, you know. So that was the decision I made to punch out and try something different, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Similar, you know, I wasn't going through the divorce, but I was, you know, I was either be a father to my 4 kids that I have, at the best of my ability, or continue on the military path. And I chose the kids, and the family on the other side. And I think what surprised me maybe the most, you know, when you tell people, you know, I'm going to hang it up, you know, when they're telling you all the time, you can be a battalion sergeant major, you'd be a great sergeant major, you should do this, you're competitive to take a ranger battalion. It's hard to tell those people, I don't want to. You know, it's really hard, and you don't want to let anybody
Yeah.
down. And I was just surprised at how positive everybody was when I said, you know, I'm going to hang it up. They said, you know, I get it. I get it. Did you have the
Yeah.
same thing with on your side?
I did, and I was surprised too. You know, I mean, geez, I want to say the day after I made that call and like called to, you know, HR branch in DC. I was like, hey man, this is what I'm doing and stuff like that. The next day, I was getting a call from a general, you know, who was my group commander when I was in Iraq, going, dude, what are you doing? And then you just explain it, and they're like, all right, I got it.
Yeah.
You know. And I had one dude, I was, you know, I was walking the halls of the Pentagon one time. And so I'm like maybe 6 months from actually retiring and being out, just doing it, you know, on TDY in the Pentagon. And I see this guy that I came up with, another officer who was a team leader, a peer in 10th group and stuff like that. And he goes, dude, I don't know if I could have made that decision.
Hmm.
And I was like, well, you know, everyone's different, man.
Yeah.
You know, and because you know, guys get hyper competitive, right? And that battalion command is a huge draw, you know. And you know, I was like, well, maybe not, man. I said, but that was mine, you know.
Yeah.
But I'd be supportive of it, you know. But he admitted, he's like, I don't know if I could have made that decision.
Yeah.
You know. But yeah, generally, you know, everyone was pretty supportive. I was felt good about that, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And then, you know, talk about your transition a little bit. It transitions. I mean, I think everybody has a little bit of a different transition path. I'd be really curious to hear from, you know, when I talk to some 05, 06s that, you know, retire, when they before they get out, some have, I mean, there's always a little bit of fear and unknown, but a lot of them think, you know, I was a battalion commander, I was this, I was that. The transition will be easy. And I've seen a lot of them when they get out, they say it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, for a number of reasons. So again, we could talk about this, I'm sure, for hours as well. But what was your experience in transition, and what advice would you give to anybody about to go through the transition out of the military?
So I'll start with the advice first, and that is take some time to figure out what you really want to do. Yeah, like really do some, you know, soul searching, for lack of a better term, and go, now what interests me,
Yeah,
right? Because if you take a job just to keep a similar level of income, in a sense, you know what I mean? And I get it. Sometimes we have to do that, right? Um, but you don't like job, you don't enjoy it, you're not passionate about, what you're going to find is that passion you had for the military, you almost don't realize you had that
Right.
until you get out, and now you're doing something else. You work for a defense contractor or whatever you're doing, right? Uh, and you go, well, it's just unsatisfying. So that's my biggest piece of advice is take a little time and some serious thought, research, and consideration into what am I going to enjoy doing?
Hmm.
What am I going to get up and be as excited about doing as when I was in, or as close as you can anyway.
Right. Yeah.
That's my biggest piece of advice, because that makes the transition seem like much less of a big deal. I feel like, okay, like, not that I don't remember my time in the Army, not that I don't appreciate it, love it, and think about it all the time and stuff like that. But I've lived a very different life now, and I love what I do, and I'm happy about it, and I enjoy doing it every day. So that's, I just think, super important. I think the guys that struggle more are the guys who didn't take that into consideration.
Yeah.
Because you got a lot of life left.
Yeah.
A lot, right? You better be doing something you enjoy doing. We all love our family. We can't be around 24/7. I'm sure my wife now doesn't want me around 24/7 anyway. So, so it's gotta be something you enjoy, something you've got some passion for.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. My transition was, I opted to not do anything related to it. Well, and I shouldn't say not related to the military, but most of the guys who were my peers went into like defense contracting jobs and things like that, or as a GS civilian, at Special Operations Command or at Northcom, good paying jobs, and I could have taken a job. I did interview for some, and I was accepted for one. Would have meant TDY for months at a time in Mexico. So more of the same.
Yep.
Not quite as cool, but similar. And so I just kind of went a different route from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree 100%. Is take a step back and get a 10,000-foot view of life and everything around, and do something you love. Because I know we've all seen it. We've seen the sergeant major, the master sergeant, the lieutenant colonel retire on Friday, put on civilian clothes, and walk right back into the same office on Monday. And it's just different. They're not. You can tell when you talk to them, they're not as happy. The missions, it's just not the same as a civilian when you stay in the contract inside. And a lot of them were chasing. They just went there for the money. And to be blunt, they've told me that. And I think it's nothing wrong with it. Just make sure you take a step back, I think, is great advice, and decide that that's really what you want to do. So when you transition out, you went into the nonprofit space, and I know a lot
Yeah.
of. There's 49,000 military nonprofits out there saying they're doing stuff for the military.
Yeah.
I just am curious, and a lot of people look at nonprofit work or are approached by nonprofits to go work for them in some capacity. What was life like in the nonprofit arena?
Yeah, I did a couple of things. Something you just said though reminded me. Another thought is, when you're getting out and you've got that choice between defense contracting type stuff or doing the same thing. Think about this: could another industry use your experience though?
Yeah.
The kind of things that you bring to the table that most people are not going to bring to the table, right? And so, what industry or what endeavor could use that experience that you have, in a different way? So, just a quick sidebar. Just thought about that when you were talking about it, but that's where I've seen people be really successful, go into something totally different, but they bring that motivation and teamwork and leadership, right, into something into some kind of area that doesn't normally have that. So, when I did, I had an opportunity to, there was a local nonprofit in Colorado Springs, small one, that was called Life Quest Military Transitions, actually. So it was all about the transition, right? And what it was doing, the big thing we had running at the time was an adaptive physical training, so adaptive PT. And we were working with all the wounded guys and gals off of Fort Carson who were in the Warrior Transition Battalion, they called it then. I believe they have a different name now, but where wounded folks went to. It started off only combat wounded, and then it became, even training situations, right? And so it was everything from TBIs to PTS to amputees, the whole shebang in these platoons. And they would come in twice a week. The platoons would come in, and we would put them through workouts. And I had basically decided to do something in like the fitness / strength and conditioning world, like working out. Maybe I own a gym, something like that. And so I was using the VA's voc rehab program to get some certifications and training, and eventually got an exercise science degree, right? And so through that program, I got introduced to this nonprofit. I started volunteering there 20 hours a week. I was doing about 20 hours a week of school. And I kind of fell in love with that aspect of getting people out of pain through exercise, basically, right? And so that's a whole deep rabbit hole. I could go into the neurological aspect of that and stuff, which we don't have time for. But it became very cool I just enjoyed doing that, right? And that nonprofit if you're in a small nonprofit, it's tough, right? Because they're always fighting for money. And like you said, there's many of them out there. Everybody's fighting for the same dollars. And yes, they're nonprofits, but that doesn't mean there's no money, because you got to pay people to do things, right? So you still got to bring in money one way, shape, or form or another, right? And usually that takes somebody working on grants and donations and things like that. So you got to have somebody doing that. And this one was a really small one, and the guy running the business side of it kind of ran it into the ground, unfortunately. So I was there about 1.5 years or 2 years. By the time I was done, I was a paid employee, and I was running all the trainers, basically, right? Developing the training programs and stuff. So that went away, and so I applied for and got accepted a job at Wounded Warrior Project, which everyone's heard of, right? Huge, so a very different nonprofit experience, a huge nonprofit, right? Pretty well run for the most part. They've had their skips and jumps, and they got in trouble for some stuff. I would say being on the inside at that time frame, or I left there a little bit before all the news things came out and stuff. Things were not quite as bad as gets put on the news. Big surprise, I'm sure, to everybody.
Right.
In the end, though, the people at my level, like manager level and below, we're doing good work, right? Working with veterans every day, doing they have a lot of different programs. I was doing peer support, like peer mentoring. We would train guys and gals who were doing really good in their recovery process and their transition process, how to mentor those who are not doing well, right? So it's an interesting world in the nonprofit world, right? I think it can be super rewarding. For sure. And it just depends really what level you're at. You know what I mean? If you're the guys who are like constantly fighting for money, that gets pretty stressful.
Yes.
Unless you're something like Wounded Warrior Project, where people are throwing money at, then you're fighting for bucks, but when you're at where the rubber meets the road, whether you're training people like I was in the one, or doing the teaching how in the peer mentor stuff, then it can be really rewarding. I would tell you one of the frustrating things that I didn't expect working in a nonprofit is when you encounter people that don't appreciate what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Kind of take it for granted that they should be getting something. They get a mentality, and I'll say this about a lot of the vets that I worked with, is there were times when people felt entitled. Mm-hmm. And I get that you put in a lot of work, and maybe you got injured, maybe you didn't, whatever the case is, right? But you start getting that entitlement kind of mindset, that's not good for anybody. It's certainly not helping you. It kind of keeps you at your broken state instead of getting out from being broken, become from a disabled veteran to an abled veteran,
Yeah.
And so that was one thing that would surprise me a little bit and like would frustrate me, that man, you're getting a lot of good programs. Maybe you could appreciate this
Yeah.
little bit more.
Yeah.
That wasn't everybody, obviously, but and there was a minority. But what I realize is there's still all kinds of people out there. You got vets that are awesome people. You got vets that are less than awesome people.
Yep.
It's still the world. There's all kinds of people. You still got to deal with everybody, just like you did in the military. And but it can be a really cool job. If I could give a piece of advice, I'd say try to find a mid-sized nonprofit, right? Not huge, Red Cross, Wounded Warrior Project, because there's bureaucracy that comes with that. There's, if you're really tiny, your days are filled with trying to get enough money, right? If you're somewhere in the middle, I think that's a good place to be. A kind of a regional kind of nonprofit works, or in a big city or something like that. That I think that's a kind of a better place to be, where you can still do a lot of good work.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Great advice there. I have a friend that says if you work for a nonprofit, they're misnamed. Nonprofit is not the right name for them, because you got to have profit, you got to turn money, you got to get money. If you just treat it like a nonprofit, and you think you're going to just passively get money coming in, you're fooling yourself, and you're not going to be in that business for very long. And then I see the coffee cup there behind you, and what is Warrior Evolved?
So, Warrior Evolved was kind of a program that the doctor that I worked with, Dr. Higgins, and he was running. He's got a big, very broad background. So he's a doctor of chiropractic, but he worked in a biomechanics lab for a while. He did like stroke rehab as a young man, and stuff like that in different times. So he's got a strength and conditioning certification, stuff like that. So he's got a very broad background in performance and getting people out of pain and things like that. He was leading the adaptive physical training overall program when I got to that small nonprofit. And so we've been together since I left the Wounded Warrior Project. We got back together. He had started his practice back up, and I became the exercise therapist, if you will, right? And so one thing we were trying to do was figure out how to work with veterans again, because we both really enjoyed it, right? And when we had that small nonprofit. And so we developed a small company called Warrior Evolved that we've been trying to, but again, it's about getting money to run programs, right? Because everybody has to work to make a living and stuff like that. But what we've done with it and at different times is run groups of veterans through different kind of programs to improve different things. We did a study for a while with a certain mode of training that improved sleep and improved hormone profiles, actually. So a lot of times when you get certain injuries, especially brain injuries, or certain conditions like PTS, that starts to screw with your brain's ability to dump hormones in the correct way. So you get lower testosterone and higher cortisol, which is the stress hormone. And a low testosterone and high cortisol ratio means you don't sleep well.
Right.
And then that just, that's a snowball effect, right? And so, we've run some different programs with that. And so we're basically still trying to figure out how we can get work with maybe a larger nonprofit. Have you ever heard of Headstrong?
Yeah.
So somebody like that, to fund some programs that we can do some things with. So that's what we've done some little things with the Warrior Evolved program. Basically it's all about getting people out of pain and improving. It's a little tough to think about your transition into civilian world if you're in pain all the time.
Yes.
So it's really a program to do that, kind of get people out of pain and teach them how to continue that.
Yeah.
Right. Give them a toolbox of things that they can do that keep you out of pain, lower that pain, so you can focus on the rest of your life, right?
Right. And you're still doing, you're still involved with Warrior Evolve, still going, and you're doing stuff on that side as well, right?
A little bit, yeah. It hasn't been as much lately. We'd like to bump it up more in the next year or so. That's one thing we're going to try to do, is try to figure out, especially now post pandemic and all that stuff. It's harder to go, hey, let's fly in 50 guys and gals, veterans from all over the place. People don't want to do that and stuff. So what I've been thinking about and we've been playing with is, how do we build this into an online program?
Yeah.
Right. That then people can do it at their own pace and things like that, like a video-based program or something like that. So that's one thing we're trying to kind of figure out what the best way to do that is, because I think then you can approach more people, right? Or get more. And then, like, hey, you got to come to our little place here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So that would be the ideal platform, I think. And then have maybe like online live events periodically throughout the year that explain things and drive people towards it to try and help, especially if you got a guy living in the middle of Wyoming somewhere. He needs some other kind of form that he can tap into, right?
Yeah, it's important. It's a different, in the veteran community, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to get to people, right? And the more ways you can do it, and using the technology we have today, hopefully we can save some people from being in pain. And then ultimately, that 22 a day, that number flexes from 15 to 30. It's
right.
Hopefully we can take care of some of those. So to kind of land the plane here and bring it in to close it out, I just, the question I ask everybody is, if you could go back and tell that young Lieutenant Marques some advice, what would you tell him?
Listen to your NCOs. Yeah. Well, I say that because I did.
Yeah.
And it saved my ass on more than one occasion.
Yeah.
In training and in combat and in the garrison.
Yeah.
I mean, that is I got it beat into me at infantry officer basic course there at Benning, about, and so, and then when I got to Korea, I said, yeah, okay, I'm in charge, but talk to me. Right. Like, I mean, so what that equates to everybody is, know what you don't know, be okay with it, right? And ask people for help when you need it.
Yeah.
And that goes to vets too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and because there's always somebody out there who's got more knowledge than you at something.
Yep.
Always.
Yeah. I think, 100%. I think sometimes, well, a lot of the times, the best advice is the simplest. It really is. Listen to your NCOs. For any young lieutenant, that's great advice. And it's, if you really listen to your NCOs, that starts a dialogue, it starts a conversation, and then you become more than just a leadership. You become a family, you become a team, that mutually respects one another and supports one another. It's going to make you successful as a unit, even though that time, is brief. A lot of times a little bit too brief, but simple advice. But every junior officer in the world, especially the infantry, has heard that multiple times in their careers. So Pat, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing your story. Thanks for all you're doing and continuing to do for veterans in the veteran community. And for everybody out there watching, and do the like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff. And we'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks, Pat.
Thanks a lot. You appreciate it, man.